Hello and welcome back to Totally Abstracted. Today I want to talk about that particular kind of disappointment that sometimes happens in painting. You start with this feeling you want to create, or maybe you have an image in mind, or you're using a reference photo. Whatever it is pulling you and you want to paint it. You can almost feel the finished piece before you touch the surface. You imagine what it will be like, and with a lot of hope and optimism, you start to work. And then you paint it, and it's not the thing you imagined, not the feeling you thought you'd capture. Maybe the painting is flatter in some way. Maybe it's more literal than you intended. Maybe it's just not as good as you imagined. And honestly, I think nearly every artist experiences this, even the ones whose work you admire most. I've definitely had a week of it. So in today's episode, I want to talk about that gap between vision and execution, why that gap never fully disappears, and how learning to work with it, instead of constantly fighting it, changes things. I think one of the hardest things about painting is that your taste develops faster than your ability. You can see things perhaps emotionally and aesthetically before you fully know how to create them physically. Your imagination has no limitations, but maybe your painting does. And your imagination doesn't have things like drying times, muddy colours, awkward proportions, overworked edges, maybe surfaces that for some reason suddenly stop cooperating. In your head, everything exists in possibility. But on the canvas, every mark is a decision, it's visible, and sometimes it's limited in some way. I think that's why paintings often feel smaller than the vision that created them. Imagination is infinite, and reality is always a translation of that. And translations always lose something. The act of bringing something out of inner space and into physical space is inherently a negotiation of sorts. But this doesn't mean the painted version is a failure. It just means it's a different thing, a thing that now exists in the world with weight and texture and edges, rather than something just inside you. I think artists sometimes assume this gap is a sign they're failing. But actually, I think the gap is evidence that your eye is evolving. You can now perceive subtleties that your current technical habits perhaps can't consistently reproduce yet. Now that's frustrating, but it's also what drives us forward, keeps us growing. If your ability perfectly matched your vision all the time, you might stop pushing. So the dissatisfaction is definitely painful, but it also gives us a direction to follow, and it points towards what matters to you. It's basically a kind of map. It's showing you the distance between where you are and where you're heading. And the fact you can even perceive that distance, that you can feel that difference between what the painting is and what you wanted it to be, I think that's your artistic sensibility doing its job. And I think there's another layer to this too. The painting in your head may not be an actual painting. It might be a feeling or a mood. And when we imagine work internally, sometimes the atmosphere, the meaning, the memory, colour, symbolism, all fuse together in a way. But making a painting means unfolding that feeling through the physical process, and that can be messy. I've noticed this especially with atmospheric abstract landscape work. Sometimes the idea of the painting feels almost transcendent, but once I start trying to pin it down too literally, it loses some of the mystery that made it exciting in the first place. And once you make a decision, once you choose this blue rather than that one, or to do a sharp edge here rather than softness, you're collapsing some of that possibility. You're making the painting specific. And that's always a narrowing, however abstract you're keeping it. It's always a narrowing of some sort. And I think social media makes all of this worse. We mostly see resolved outcomes, finished pieces, edited time lapses, strong compositions, people's signature styles. We rarely see the hundreds of awkward paintings sitting underneath those moments, We don't see the paintings that were abandoned, turned to the wall, painted over. We don't see the in-between stages, the ones where everything looked very wrong before it somehow found its way. We also rarely see the artist's inner experience, well, never, unless they choose to write about it or share it in some way, the inner experience of making the work. The doubt, the false starts, the moments they nearly wipe the whole thing back and start it again. So we as artists, seeing all this finished, completed work, think, I'm the one failing. But if you hear enough artists speak honestly, you realise the opposite is true. A huge amount of art making is negotiation, adjustment, recovery, listening, changing direction halfway through, letting go of the original plan because the painting itself seemed to start asking for something else. The most skilled artists I've read about or listened to don't talk about effortless execution. They talk about attentiveness, responsiveness, and knowing when to push and when to stop, which is a very different skill from simply reproducing what you imagine or what you see in a reference photo. And this is the part I think that took me a long time to understand, that the goal is not to force the painting to become the image you intended. The goal is to stay in relationship with what's actually emerging. Because sometimes the painting fails compared to the original vision, but it succeeds as something unexpected. They're not the same thing, and some of my favourite paintings happened after I stopped trying to rescue the original idea. There's a moment where you realise this isn't that painting, it's not becoming the painting I intended, but maybe it's becoming itself. And I think that shift really matters. It changes everything about how you then hold the brush or your tools, how you read the surface and what you start allowing. Because fighting the painting usually tightens the work. You start correcting instead of responding, and you stop noticing what's interesting because you're so focused on what's missing. Paintings made from that place, well, I think there's a kind of anxiety visible in the surface. The work looks like it was made by someone trying to fix something rather than discover something. Whereas paintings where you release the original plan and follow instead, they have a quality of aliveness. Even if they're technically imperfect, even if they're rough at the edges, something happened there, and I think the viewer can feel it. And I think that's why process matters so much in abstract landscape work especially. Not process as rigid method, but process as conversation. I think of it as call and response. You make mark, the painting answers back, you react, it changes again, and so on and so forth. Gradually something appears that neither you nor the painting could have fully predicted at the start. And that's collaboration. It's the difference between writing a speech and having a conversation. One is just transmission, but the other is exchange. And paintings made through exchange, where you're genuinely listening as well as speaking, have a different quality to them. It's a quality that can't quite be planned or replicated because it emerged from the actual encounter between you and the surface on that particular day. Now, I'm not saying technical skill doesn't matter. Of course it does. The more fluent you become with things like value, edges, composition, colour relationships, I think the closer you can move forward to what you intend at the outset. Technique expands your vocabulary. It gives you more options in that moment of response, more ways to say yes to what the painting is asking for. But even highly skilled painters experience the gap because it isn't just technical. The imagination will always outrun the hand slightly. And I think that's part of what keeps artists creating for decades. You're always chasing something just beyond full capture. And maybe that's not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be accepted and even loved. I think in a sense, painting is about leaving traces of an encounter. Evidence that you wrestled with something difficult to articulate. Could be a mood, a memory, a place you visited that you wanted to mark somehow, so that someone else standing in front of the canvas might feel a faint echo of what you felt. Not the same thing exactly, but something similar. And maybe viewers don't need the painting to match your original vision perfectly for that. Maybe they just need to feel that something real happened there, that the painter was genuinely in it, and that the marks came from somewhere true. So perhaps that's the gift of the gap, that by trying to reach what we couldn't quite reach, we sometimes make something that points beyond itself, something that gestures toward the ineffable instead of merely illustrating the familiar. So if you're frustrated because your work looks better in your head, that probably means you care deeply about what you're trying to make. It means your artist sensibility is working. It might mean it's reaching ahead of your current consistency, and that's uncomfortable, but it's normal. It's not a sign you're doing it wrong. The trick isn't to eliminate the gap, and it's learning not to interpret the gap as proof you shouldn't continue. It's learning to see the gap as an invitation, as the space where growth lives. Because the artists who grow aren't necessarily the ones who feel more satisfied. They're often the ones who keep painting anyway, even while chasing something they still can't fully catch, even through disappointing sessions like nearly all the ones I've had this week. We keep showing up, and in that sustained showing up, I think something shifts over time. And maybe art lives in the space between what we can imagine and what we can bring into the world. Maybe we just paint traces, proof that we were here and that something mattered to us, and that we kept reaching for it. Thank you for listening. As always, keep exploring, keep experimenting, and keep things totally abstracted.